done right. And I sat there and I looked at him. And I said, white man, you really think I done right? Yeah, you done right. You done right. He just stuck to it and stayed there for so long. When he left, he said, don't tell nobody else I come to see you. He didn't want nobody else to know it, but he knowed I done right. I knowed I done right. I had to stand up for myself. I had to. I come into this world with this against me. If a man come to take away what I have and he don't have a fair claim to it, I'll die before I stand quiet as a fence post and let him do it. If I die trying to defend myself, why let me go? I'm going to try definitely. I tried my best to tell people today about this past way of life, but a heap of them don't want to hear it. And let me know it to my face. Or we'd rather you talk about something else. We want to forget about what you're talking about. But I've had my eyes open too long to the facts, and my ears would have heard, and my hands would have touched, and what have touched me is a fact, you see. I was born in 1885. That's a very long time ago. And I know more about the happenings under this way of life than I can tell. Hayes Shaw was my daddy. He was kind of a raw-boned, slender man like I am. He's just about my color, maybe a shade darker. Oh, he was dark. I never did know his daddy, but I know his mother well. Her name was Celie. That's what we called her. And my grandmother, she was fractious. Her second husband after my daddy's daddy was an old man by the name of Abner Todd. When the end of his day come near, he taken sick and got down on his bed. Grandma Celie told him, if you gonna die, die. I can do better without a man. Well, in her comings and spending time with my daddy and his family, Grandma Celie told we children many a time. She said, why, your daddy was my baby boy. He was my youngest child. He was 15 years old when he surrendered. Now, I never did have no knowledge of what surrendering was. I was just a chap. But it come to me like this. That was in the days of freeing the colored people. My daddy come through 15 years into slavery. His people worked for the Shaws. They was his masters, white people. That's where our name comes from. Now, my mother's name was Liza Cobb. She was a deep yellow woman. Her mother was a half-white woman. Now, my mother kept a lock of her mother's hair in a little tin box. Kept it for as long as she lived. That box was open many a time. Now, I seen that lock of hair laying in it. It was long, black hair, straight hair. My daddy said it was laying in that box, growing. And my mother, if I had a dollar bill every time I seen my daddy beat up my mother, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be a rich man. When he'd get unreasonably mad, he'd grab some old leather mule line, double her up, and stand up before my mother's face and strap her down. I don't expect it ever come to his mind what his children thought about it or how we'd remember him for it. But it was a poor example to stamp and beat up children's mothers right before them. I was 9 years old when my mother died. She died of the dropsy. Swelled up all over her body. Feet and legs swelled up so bad they shined. My daddy even had a doctor to her, but the doctor couldn't help her none. People come over giving advice, visiting, sitting with my mother, and they told my daddy to get some of these, there's this old bush, it's called a hollyhock, and it has these leaves, and these leaves got little stickers all around them, and they told him to get some hollyhocks, tear a twig off about 2 feet long, and whip her feet with them. Now, he'd squat down beside her, and he'd whip her feet. Whip them light, just enough for them old leaves to prick her skin. And good God, the water would run out of her feet into little pools on the floor. He'd put a cloth down there to catch it. She stood it. It hurt plenty, I reckon, but she stood it. He'd sit there and he'd whip her feet. but it didn't do her no good under God's son. Well, my daddy got in a plumb hurry to marry again. 3 weeks to Christmas that same year, he married my stepmother. She was a Reed, Maggie Reed. Now, she and him was the mother and father of 13 children. My daddy come into contact with enough women so that he claimed 4 outside children, too. Well, my daddy loved women. Good God, he loved women. He was a rooster. Yeah, he was a humdinger. Poor daddy's dead and gone now, too, and I don't tell no lies on him. He put me to plowing for the first time at 9 years old, right after my mother died. Now, I wasn't big enough to do the job, and that's the truth. The country we was living on was rough, rocky. And I had to plow barefooted, too. Anything liable to skin up my feet. Sometimes my daddy would come off his hunt, and he'd come across the field, and I'd be plowing right along. And that old mule would throw up his head, turn around, look at me, and kick at the plow. Now, it didn't suit my daddy to have his mule acting up like that, and his boy can't control him. So I just plowed right along, and my daddy would stand off in a row until I plowed up close to him. He'd say, "Nate?" "Yes, sir." "What sort of plowing is that you doing? What sort of plowing is that you doing?" And he liked to blow me down, and I told him, I was doing the best I can, Papa. I was doing the best I can. Next word, "Drop them britches, boy, drop them britches." And he'd walk up to me, and if I wasn't getting them britches down fast enough to suit him, he'd grab me, drop my britches, stick my head between his legs, and when he got done, that plow line was hot. Whew. Yeah, but I had to like him. I had to like him. If he thought my mind was running against the way he wanted it to, right there would be a beating up. See all that? Child ain't got no business bucking his parents. Parents ain't got no business beating the child. Now, the only chance a poor boy like me had to get an education was to leave this country. Now, there was an old preacher come out of Tuskegee by the name of B.B. Fletcher. He was pretty heavy-built old man. He wasn't as high, or his head. He could walk under a tall horse and never touched it. Well, sometimes he'd stop and visit on his way to New Morning Church. One day he said to my daddy, he said, "Brother Shaw, give me that boy. I see something in him." Now, that was mean. "Brother Shaw, I'll let him learn any kind of trade he wants to learn if you just give him to me." Now, that was an old word my daddy used to speak. That man just as well had been singing songs to a dead hog. Wasn't no way in the world that preacher was going to get me out of there. My daddy was depending on me, education or no education to what? You see, my daddy was a free man, but in his acts, he was a slave. Now, true, I seen my daddy cleaned up twice. I seen it. Everything he had, they taken away from him. One time we was living on Mr. Lloyd Alby's place, and Mr. Albee had a note on my daddy. He was furnishing my daddy. Had a mortgage on all my daddy's property, stock included. My daddy had 5 or 6 head of cattle at the time. One day, this old white gentleman by the name of Mr. Walker, he come to see my daddy, and he wanted to buy one of them cows. A few days later, my daddy went to see Mr. Albert to ask a release to sell that cow to Mr. Walker. Mr. Albert gave him a release to sell it. My daddy sold the cow, carried the money to Mr. Albert. White man took the money, turned around, sued my daddy for selling mortgage property. Put my daddy in the Beaufort jail for selling that cow. Now, while my daddy was in jail, Mr. Albert come to the house, and he take my daddy's cows, mules, harnesses, plows. Mr. Albert taking everything my daddy had except going in the house and taking the house furniture. Even went in the lot and taking the fattened hog. You see, in those days, it was out of the knowledge of the colored man to understand that if you give the man a note exactly how you were subject to the laws, the colored man wasn't educated to the laws for his use. They was a great dark secret to him. Well, when my daddy got out of jail, we moved up the road on the Wheeler place, and he never did prosper none after that. Well, come 1904, I got up to be 19 years old, and I began to feel my man. My daddy decided to hire me out. Well, he hired me out all right, and he ate up my wages just as fast as I worked. Yeah, He hired me out to a fella by the name of Jack Nolan. Now, I always was, not boasting or bragging, I always was an apt little kid, and I was willing. And Mr. Nolan to leave all his farming to me, see after, keep it going. I was his foreman in a way of speaking. Now, I see he was giving me a responsibility he wasn't giving the other hired boys. Well, that stuck me up. Made me think a lot of myself. One evening, I come home, and I learned that Jim Flint's cattle was breaking in the corn on the creek, eating my daddy's corn up. Now, I know that was a white man that was in the habit of letting his stock destroy what other folks had, and it wasn't nothing to it, especially if it was a nigger. And my daddy said, "Son, Jim Flint's cattle is ruining my bottom of corn down on Cedar Marcus." I said, "Doing what, Papa?" "Yeah, just ruining it. Eating up your corn on the creek?" I sat there and I looked at him and I studied it over. And right there and then I felt that I was a man. And I began to take on man's ways, man's acts. And I said, "Papa, he gonna keep them cows out your corn, and I don't mean maybe. He gonna keep them cows out of there." Well, my daddy looked at me and he said, "Son, don't say nothing about it. It might cause trouble." And he said them words to me. It touched me, and it touched me very deep. Man stock eating up his corn, destroying his crops, wouldn't say nothing to him about it, didn't want me to say nothing. Shoot. The only way I wouldn't have said something, God would have paralyzed my tongue. Well, that next day, I went over to Flint's place. Old Lady Potter was at the house. Now, the whole community knows that Flint was using a colored woman for a wife, but niggers wouldn't matter with it. So I stopped there like a man should. Old Lady Potter poked her head out the kitchen window, and she said, "Mr. Flint ain't here this morning. He went to Apophalia. He left before daylight." And I said, "Well, you tell him when he comes home. Tell him when he comes home," I said, "to keep his cows out of my daddy's corn down yonder on the creek, and I don't mean maybe. Tell him to keep them cows out of there." Well, the next time I come home, first thing my daddy said was, "Son, I told you not to say nothing to Flint about his cows eating up my corn. Now he's hot as the devil. He come over here and he told me, 'You ought to hear the words that big man Nate left for me at my house. I'm gonna whip Nate's ass.'" When I heard that, I had a thought. "Papa, what'd you say to him when he said he was gonna whip my ass?" "I never said nothing." "I'm gonna tell you something, Papa," and I weren't no chap. "You just let him jump on me whenever he pleases. You let him do it. And I guarantee you, won't nobody have to get him off of me." So I just went backwards and forwards through that white man's yard. He never would say nothing to me, neither. I wanted him to say something. He wouldn't say humph about it. Well, rocky long, 1905, and I began to pick up and spur my own horse in. I was up in the world big enough and old enough to start the corresponding a girl. Hannah Ramsey. Now, Hannah was the daughter of my stepmother's brother. She lived about 2 miles due west of us. I knowed Hannah, been knowing her from a boy up. And my stepmother would carry me over to her brother, little Waldo Ramsey's house, and I'd play with his children and Hannah amongst them. Now, she always, well, I watched Hannah. Always watched her. She was quiet and she was pretty. And anyhow I could, I'd meet up with her, look at her, howdy with her. I'd meet her at church. Now, I was fast and flip, but I tried to carry myself in a nice way. And just as soon as I seen her, just as soon as I spied her in that crowd of girls, well, I'd reach up and I'd touch my old hat, and I'd pull the brim down over my eyes. Anna would come up to me and she said, "Well, Mr. Shaw, how is Aunt Maggie and Uncle Hayes getting along? Well, they all just fine there. They all right." She'd say to me, "Well, is you enjoying this fine weather we having?" I expect so. I am all right. Being as it ain't too hot and it ain't too cold, it's just right. Well, lingering along, and it come to me just as plain as day, I fell in love with that girl. Now, I did not meddle her under God's son, nor be fresh around her. But by the time I got up to be about 20 years old, I would have no other. She was my heartthrob and my choice for a wife. Now, I got to where I couldn't stay away from her. I done waited as long as I could. So, I got right busy, prepared myself all week. Come Sunday, I fixed myself up, and I got on my daddy's buggy, and I took a drive. Drove straight on down to Mr. Will Speedy's house where Hannah was. And I got there, and the house was full of girls. Ooh-wee! Well, I drove up, and I stopped. They come jumping at that house in the yard, running in their long skirts. Now, Hannah wasn't saying nothing, just laughing with the rest of them. One of them gals said to me, "Well, what you doing way down here, Mr. Shaw, huh? You way out your country. How come you come down here, Hannah's here. That's the reason of it. Don't you understand? Hannah's here. That's who he come down here after." Well, they come running out to my buggy, and they surrounded me, and they commenced to chatting and talking. I wasn't saying nothing, just looking at them, humoring them in their talk. Now, I always was a fella that taken well amongst the girls. All I had to do was to present myself, and the girls would cut buttonholes over me. Oh, I was a heavy hitter. Surely, I could hit heavy any way I wanted to. But there was just one in that bunch I liked better than all the others. Consequently, I didn't go no further with them than to treat them right, and treat them with respect. So, ain't that how come you come down here, Mr. Shaw? Didn't you come down here to carry Hannah home? Ooh, they was hot at me. But I just looked straight at them, pulled myself up in that buggy seat, and I said, "If them buggy wheels turn over, I'm going to carry her home. That's all I give them." Hannah smiled, and when that crowd broke, then I asked Hannah for the privilege of carrying her home. And when that buggy left there, she left on it with me. Well, that evening, just before sundown, we landed at her house. I stayed until about first dark, and then I decided I'd better be pulling out. But before I did, I hit her a hard lick. And this is the way I hit her. Talking low. I said, "Well, do you love me? Or think enough of me to live a married life with me?" Oh, that stuck her. Yeah, she smiled, but she was slow to answer. And she said, as a girl would, "Well, Mr. Shaw, I'll talk further about that on your next trip." Very well, as far as talking goes, we'll talk. But I want to know now. Oh, she hated to say it. She hated to say it. But she decided to make up her mind right there and answer my question. I married Hannah. Yes, I did, on a Sunday evening, December 1906. I married her at Aunt Stella's house. Mother Ramsey put flowers all around, and when that crowd broke, we sat around laughing and talking, and at the usual time, me and her went to bed in a room at her daddy's house right by ourselves. And that night, that Sunday night, I stood up there and married Hannah. I didn't know no more about being with her in nature's course than I knowed about flying. Yeah, and it wouldn't have been no harm if I did. I meant to carry out the full obligation of my acts. My first child was born August 20, 1907, on the Curtis place. That was Calvin Thomas. Now, I kept the dates of the first ones, but when my work commenced to coming on substantially, I quit checking on dates. But I do know when the first two was born, Calvin and then Rachel, August 22nd, 1909. In 1907, I made 3 pretty good bales of cotton that year, but when the crops was gathered and laid by, it took all them 3 bales to pay the landlord off for what I owed him, and it took part of my corn crop to pay him off, too. In the place of prospering, I was on a standstill. Well, I worked in the scuffle 4 years. First one way, then another, making baskets, cutting stove wood for people, until I could buy me a mule, so I could rent a little land and give up sharecropping. Got my crops gathered in 1910, and I went out and I bought myself a mule, paid $100 cash. And she had a good deal of age on her, but she was a stinking good mule. 1911, I moved on to Mr. Bill Reeves' place. Old white gentleman. Paid him cash rent. Made a profit from my farming, and I come up from the bottom then. And I was saving a little money at the end of each year, getting a footing to where I wouldn't have to ask nobody for nothing. Yeah, come 1913, I bought myself another mule, young mule. Had never had the bridle on, just 3 years old. I give Mr. Grimes at the Apple Failure Mule Pen $185 for that mule. Carried her home, put her in the lot with that $100 mule. Hannah named her Mattie. She thought the world of that mule. Yeah, that Mattie mule was as pretty as a peeled onion. Next morning, I got up and I told Hannah, I said, darling, get breakfast ready as quick as you can. I'm going to see Mr. Sadler in Apple Failure and swap that 1-horse wagon and get me a 2-horse wagon. Well, I made that trade. I hitched both them mules to that 2-horse wagon, and I said, come up, come up. And I drove on home in the midst of the rain. Didn't stop driving till I got to my daddy's house. I called his attention. He come to the door and he looked out. He seen me standing up in that brand new 2-horse wagon with a pair of pretty mules hitched to it. He stretched his eyes and he said, son, whose team is that? I said, mine. My team, Papa. My wagon. Mine. Well, spring of the year, 1914, I moved on to Mr. Lemuel Tucker's place down on City Marcus Creek. Now, that was boll weevil time. The boll weevil was in circulation. My daddy didn't know about the boll weevil in his day. They blowed in here from the western countries. I was scared of the boll weevil to an extent. I soon learned it'd destroy a cotton crop. Yeah, all God's dangers ain't a white man. When the boll weevil starts depositing them eggs in them cotton squares, that's when he kill you. But I can't hate God's pests definitely, because they're doing what God put them here to do. What a boll weevil might do to me ain't half as bad as what a man might do. I go out to my fields and I shake a little poison dust over my crops, and the boll weevil would just sail away. But how can I sling a man off my back? When I moved on to Mr. Lemuel Tucker's place, I had to go under joint note. All his hands and the man himself. Mr. Tucker had all our stuff mortgaged by his own rulings, and he used it to stand security at the bank. Now, he was the only one that could draw money on that note, but we was responsible for what he owed. I was on that note for 5 long years. Every year, I'd come up just a little bit deeper. 5th year, I dropped into town, and I asked him, "What are you holding against me now, Mr. Tucker?" Now, he had a knack of scratching and spitting when he talked. By George, Nate, you owe me $500. And got all my crops for 5 long years, and I still owed him $500. I tell you, I labored under that debt. All right. Come fall, Tucker was traveling around amongst his hands crying about how much he needed money. And said to me, By George, Nate, I see you got 3 bales of my cotton in your yard, and I'm up here for some money. I need it for my business affairs. Load up your cotton, carry it on in the apple failure, sell it, and get me up some money. All right. Decided being as I owed Tucker, I'd go ahead and do it. That was in the war time. Hit the war, that cotton brought over 40 cents a pound. That high-priced cotton pulled the kinks out of me. I got a check for $560. I paid Tucker what I owed him, and right there and then it struck my heart and mind, you will never get another note on me, never under Christ's kingdom. All right, come spring, I go into Mr. Bishop's store to buy some fertilizer. I've been buying fertilizer from him for several years. He looked at me, and he said, "I wouldn't sell you a bit. Go ahead. Go through Mr. Tucker like you've been doing." Yeah, he turned me down just like I was a dog. Friendship business amongst the whites driving me back to the man I throwed off me. Well, that evening I seen Mr. Tucker in town. I said, "Mr. Tucker, it appears to me that I can't buy no guano at all this year. Won't none of them sell me a bit. Now, surely, you had a hand in this mess." By George, Nate, you go over to that bank and sign your note. No, sir. I ain't signed it today, and I ain't gonna sign it. Well, I ain't letting you have no fertilizer unless you sign that note. All right. Mr. Harry Black lived out in the country, and during the period that I was living with Mr. Bill Reeves, I bought my fertilizer from him. So I politely walked up to Mr. Black and laid my plight to him. "Mr. Black, Mr. Tucker got me barred on fertilizer. Won't none of them sell me no guano." Mr. Black looked at me and he said, "The hell they won't, damn it. I'll see to it. You go on home, and on a Monday morning, you hitch up your mules, carry 'em on down the apple failure, and get all the damn fertilizer you want. I'll show them they can't do you that way." Yeah, Mr. Black was a different type man. He was a white man that recognized all men. Well, the next time I seen Mr. Tucker, I said to him, "Mr. Tucker, it appears to me that I won't need your help getting no fertilizer after all." He about fell out the box when I told him that. I was my own man then. I found somebody that would deal with me. Now, after I got off from under Tucker, I moved on to a little place near Twofork and become entangled with Mr. Lester Watson. And in the wind-up, big trouble come off. Mr. Watson agreed to sell me his place for $1,600. I was buying my own land at last. Now, 4 children come with me when we moved. Calvin, Rachel, Vernon, and Francie. Mary Jane was my youngest and first child born on the Watson place, and the balance of my children after her, 4 of them was born now. Now, the oldest children was going to school at the time, but it wasn't much. White schools floating along, running on schedule. Colored schools doing nothing, standing still, waiting for a change to start. When the colored schools did start, they didn't run over a month and a half or 2. Word would go out from the headquarters, close the schools down, close the schools down, money is out. As soon as they closed the colored schools down, the cotton was ready to chop. White man children going to school, and the colored children had to jump in his fields, go to chopping cotton. Now, being as mine stayed at home, my children was great help to me in the field. Now, I didn't put my chaps in no rough places and look for my work to be done. My boys was eager to learn. And the truth, I loved having them around. Now, cotton wasn't bringing much that year. Between 10 and a half, 12 cents a pound, and got even lower than that, lower than any man believed it would fall. But I was making good money hauling lumber. I started in the hauling right after the cotton was laid by. Graham Pike Lumber Company was giving every man a job that had a pair of good mules. Now, I kept my mules looking like they belonged to somebody. I brought as high as $225 a month hauling. That was a lot of money, but I was supporting my family. I aimed to keep them happy, and I was able from my labor to do so. Now, I was a fool about keeping them happy. I bought my wife a sewing machine, and I also bought a record player. Cost $60-something at the time. Yeah. I bought a brand new Ford car while I was hauling lumber, and it got to where after 2 years, my boys wanted me to change that car and get a Chevrolet. A little high-grade car. When I come home from the car dealer, Hannah was standing out in the yard, and she said, you get them boys whatever they want, just as long as you can reach it. And after a while, we ain't gonna have nothing here but cars. I said to her, them boys do whatever I tell them to do without a grumble, and I'm gonna pleasure them just as long as I can. Now, ain't you got something there to do in the house? Yes. I got plenty to do there in the house. And I got plenty to do out here. Watching you full up our yard with cars. Well, maybe I had a little bit more than other folks got. And maybe I was standing in a good position. And if you get that way in this world, you better be prepared to defend yourself against words and bullets. Bullets and words. Hot knocked off again, 1928. Come pretty wide open to me and touched the hem of my garment. Lots of farmers was in the hole. A heap of them leaving, going north. Some of my neighbors even picked up and left. That didn't come in my mind. I didn't intend to get out. I moved on to Watson place with plenty that was paid for. And I thought I was buying my own land at last. But as my old daddy used to say, the devil's got more lives than a cat. One day, Hannah told me a card come in the mailbox telling me to come to the bank in Apple Failure and sign notes on my place. And I said, if I go, any way I go, you going with me. She had book learning, she could read and write. And I said, I think my best business should be in your hands. If anybody knows the ins and outs of it, you the one to know. So we jumped on my Chevrolet car.